Well, today's going to be a fascinating things hidden discussion, and I'm joined by Dr. Anthony Bartlett, and we've had him on the program before, talking about his book Theology Beyond Metaphysics, and now we're going to return to kind of the next part of his journey and his work. He has a new book called Signs of Change: The Bible's Evolution of Divine Nonviolence, and it'll be a great discussion. He's someone who's well versed in Girardian anthropology as well as theology. He served as a Roman Catholic priest, and now he is on a different journey. He's also authored several books, including a sci-fi novel. So that's great to have you on the program again.
It's lovely to be here, David. I thank you for having me back. I enjoyed it a lot the first time. I'm looking forward to this.
Yeah. So, first of all, there's a few ways we could start, but you talk about semiotics in this book again. For those who are just tuning in for the first time, who are not familiar, my audience, the podcast is called Things Hidden, so there's a lot of Girard fans here. So, we don't have to go too basic on that one, but the term semiotics and the use of the word signs. What do you mean by that briefly when you use this in the book, Signs of Change?
Yeah, well, when we did this podcast last time, you basically asked me the same question, and to some degree, I thought, well, do I have to go through the whole history of since the 15th century of Western philosophy to get to semiotics?
Yeah.
But of course, that's not, you can't do that, and it's not useful. The useful way in, although that does exist, that progression of thought that gets you to semiotics, the useful way in is through Girard himself. And I thought afterwards, I didn't really stress that enough, that Girard has his own semiotic theory. In other words, he gives an explanation for the origin of human science, for what they call the symbolic animal, the animal, which is what we are, that uses abstract referential symbols in order to organize the world. And he says the first symbol is the body of the initial victim.
Right.
That is the earth symbol, the underlying symbol to everything that then condenses the world into a kind of meaning.
Is it the victim killed or the victim pointed out as the one to be excluded?
It's the victim killed, but then with all the experience attached. In other words, the horror, and then the resolution of the horror, the peace that prevails, the coming of religion, all that is packed into that one sign. It's the transcendental sign itself. So when Girard, if you think about Girard himself proposing a semiotics, then it's kind of easier for us to get into the material and see that then he also joins a stream. I mean, Girard wasn't a philosopher, and that's quite important to point out. He kind of eschewed philosophy. He kind of stayed away from it.
Yeah.
Because he was basically an historian to begin with. That was his discipline he began with, and then he began reading literature. He is a fabulous reader of texts. Like, there's no one can get into a text, any kind of text really, the way Girard does. And then he broadened it into anthropology necessarily when he began to see mimesis and violence as a result. So he develops his own kind of intellectual discipline. It's his own kind of invention almost. So philosophy stands over to the side, but really since Immanuel Kant, say in the end of the 18th century, there is this shift from abstract eternal truths to the way in which human beings actually construct their world.
Right.
And semiotics, meaning that the study of signs, and I am using signs at the moment to talk to you. So when I say talk, that immediately has a whole series.
You're using signs with your hands too. Those are part.
That's exactly right.
Those are signs, right?
They are totally signs. They're totally.
Our outfits are signs, right? The way we shave our beards, our icons,
everything.
That's not a green screen. That's
exactly right. We live in a world of signs. That is our human. And of course, now with social media, we're in a world saturated with signs, and so it's actually a very contemporary way of looking at humanity in terms of the signs it creates to give meaning to itself. So if you join that together with Girard and says, well, Girard says the origin of our signs is this primordial act of violence, killing this collective victim, then concentrates the world into a whole of meaning. They say, well, if that's where our science comes from, is a pretty awful thing, you know, like that our world is constructed out of this kind of generative violence. But then as Girard himself does, and as I explain in Theology Beyond Metaphysics, he introduces the Bible, as I say, as an alternative kind of weave a texture of science that puts us in a different world of meaning.
Right. And that's the way in which we are able to free ourselves from our bad habits that are destroying.
That's exactly right. And I just have to underline within that, if anybody's kind of wondering, you know, how that ultimately works, is that in Theology Beyond Metaphysics, I said every sign puts you in a relation or a relationship. Every sign, a sign is a relationship. So especially I say something like bread or house, you know, there's immediately a personal relationship, you know, like I'm hungry or I like bread or whatever, or I want to live in a house. There's always that. It's not like a computer that just has a series of bytes in its electrical apparatus to connect the signs. No, we are in relationship to what we're talking about. So I say that so the whole argument here in the capsule that I make is that if we are fundamentally in relationship to violence, which is the Girardian argument, through the intervention of the biblical God, we become fundamentally in relationship to a new source of meaning, which is actually divine nonviolence. There is this kind of being, this source of meaning, of truth, of relationship, which we enter into. That's what being a Christian is. I will enter into, I accept to enter into this relationship of faith with Christ. That puts us in relationship with an alternative generative source of meaning.
Right. And that it was signs and wonders. Is that how does that fit into
Yes,
the
that's right. I
taxonomy
mean,
of signs?
yeah, absolutely. The Bible, you know, the Psalms celebrate the signs and wonders that you did. You know, like if you start with Exodus, which the book does. Here, I'm going to wave it in front of you so that you remember what it looks like.
Yeah.
Oh, that's it.
Yeah, I have a copy too here.
Yeah, there you go. If you start with signs and wonders,
you gave that to me through the screen, didn't you? Just now.
Yes, there you go.
Sign and wonder. There you
go. Exactly, David. You're on this. You're on it. It is. That's a communication, and we did a mimetic communication there.
Yeah.
Your mirror neurons picked up what I was doing, and then did something physically to mirror what I was doing.
That's that's kind of like communion, right? You're communing with one another, right?
Yes, absolutely. And when you commune in that spirit of divine nonviolence, that is the end goal of humanity.
It would be rivalrous if I pulled out this book and said, "Well, this is my book. Read it," and you know, as you did yours, right? That would be
exactly
rivalrous.
Right. And immediately we would become hostile. So you can see what a knife edge we guys are. Yeah. But as I was saying in Theology Beyond Metaphysics, that I argued that there's a relationship, and that's at the core of science, and that's
You're mentioning Exodus. You're going to mention Exodus.
Oh, I was going to mention Exodus. Yeah, that's right. In the book of Science of Change, I don't start with Genesis. I start with Exodus. And the reason for that is that is the condensing sign that creates the Jewish people, that creates the people of the law, the people of Moses, that they are led out of oppression and slavery in Egypt. And that's the narrative that you get in Exodus. And obviously, whatever the history of it, and I do go to some degree into the history, to try to unpack the kind of archaeological possibilities of this, but it's not as important in terms of the book as this narrative, which says we have been set free by this God who calls himself I am who I am, or Yahweh alternatively, or I am, that triple name of God in chapter 3 of Exodus, that this God has done this for us. So that's always a referential point. That's the starting referential point of meaning in the Jewish story begins with this liberation. And if you didn't have that, you'd still be in the flat meaning of, I would argue, of the sacred, of the killing of the victim, the covering up of that victim, the erection of the city, the empire, the king, whatever on top of that misconstruction, that lie, basically, you'd still be in that. But once God, the God of the Bible, starts moving through Exodus, so it's very important that you have that first sign and wonder. I led you through the Red Sea. I mean, that's a physical, very gripping image of being brought out of destructive violence, and to a land that I will show you. So that's, and you're being brought out of the annihilating violence of Egypt and the sea as a symbol of that. You've been brought into the possibility of new world. So that's where I start with Exodus.
Did you talk at all or look at all about the snakes with Moses' staff turning into a snake versus Pharaoh's staff?
No,
Is there any anthropological insights
I mean,
there
I suppose
about?
you could do a mimetic analysis of that, because it's a threat. And I kind of do talk about how in Exodus, God does exercise threat, serious threat against Pharaoh and Egypt. And in the end, enacts a terrible threat of violence. He kills all the firstborn. It's a quasi genocide. You're killing the inheritance of the inheritors of the race, and he does that. And so it's a very powerful sign within the kind of the cultural material, the cultural kind of files, like mental files that people have. How am I going to understand the power of this God? And that's actually what happens. The God kills the firstborn, or the destroying angel kills them, and then the people are set free. But then once you begin there, the rest of the book, Signs of Change, talks about how there's a progressive journey from that violence to non-violence, because the character of liberation of the human self ultimately has to be into a new generative relationship of love, which implies the ending of violence.
I don't think we have to put in juxtaposition the authority of the biblical text in opposition to, the historical truth of it, in the sense that, like, I look at the story of Abraham and Isaac, and one of the things that, if you study literature, is that a great artist, a great author, can use a unreliable narrator to make a point, right? And this idea of, oh, God wants me to kill my son. Oh, God doesn't want me to kill my son. This is a literary device. It's a way of communicating to your people. It's not a defect. It's not a bug. It's a feature. It's meant to get you to wrestle with the text, as Israel means, wrestling with God. And you're supposed to wrestle with what is actually asked of me here, and what does it mean to say, hey, give me your firstborn son. That was very passe for that community. Everybody was giving their firstborn son to every god around the block, around the world. But that wasn't so radical, and it's important.
No, I mean,
for people to say, oh, you're not attacking the authority of the text, to say that this,
not at all.
Yeah,
you're mining its authority. You're getting into the depth of what it's saying to you. I mean, if there are no kind of tremors or disturbances in the text, then it's just a flat stone on top of you, really. But if there are these shifts and changes, which is what Signs of Change is talking about, there are definitely these shifts. What's the engine that's driving the shifts? That's the question. What's actually driving these shifts?
Right.
Why should you not sacrifice your firstborn?
Right. And the sign ultimately is the slain lamb, right? Would you say that is a good?
Yes.
Is that a good guidepost sign that's moving?
Yeah.
The
lamb that is slain is the Passover lamb, and then in second Isaiah, it becomes the servant who's led like a lamb to the slaughter, and then in John, it becomes, behold, here is the Lamb of God. And John the Baptist, very unlikely in historical terms, but in terms again of your the writing of a text that is trying to get into the truth of what's really at stake here. Jesus is the Lamb of God, the one who's led to the slaughter in order to manifest the truth of God. And then, of course, in the book of Revelation, the Lamb of God appears, I think it's 27 times in the text, and it is the victor. He has the victory in the great final confrontation of empire, the ongoing but then final confrontation of empire and the Lamb.
Yeah.
So the Lamb is really, you're absolutely right. I mean, there could have been a figure of the Lamb on the front.
Yeah. Then what does that mean with the lion laying down with the lamb? What is that? Is there any continuity?
Because obviously that they shall do no hurt on all my holy mountain. I mean, because that's one of the favorite arguments for human violence, that it's nature. And if you talk to someone, you know, who's not really set any of this in question, and then you challenge a violent behavior, you know, like the arms race or war or whatever, they'll say, well, it's natural. I mean, animals kill, and they're designed. Many animals are designed to kill, and of course, you look back at the dinosaurs. They were immensely dangerous. So the prophetic word of Isaiah says, no, actually, that's going to be reversed in some way. At some point, that's going to be undone
in history.
In history, yes.
Which is a great mystery how that's going to work, right?
Yes, it is. It is. But we are at the point, I mean, I think, David, in response to that, we are at the point where human beings, as Gerard himself said, have to opt. I mean, in his more confident days when he wrote Things Hidden, we have to opt for some form of nonviolence, or we will destroy ourselves. And that's almost a kind of logical, kind of sociological conclusion. I mean, it flows from the actual situation we're in. But at the same time, Girard has the argument that, you know, that the Bible has revealed our founding violence, and thereby destabilized it, making it on the one hand worse. I mean, we're in this period when everything that everybody and his brother is trying to reconstruct the world out of violence, and then on the other hand, you have this revelation, this progressive sense of what God really is doing, rather than trying to transfer us to some heavenly state out of here in that kind of Greek style Olympian upper world where the gods are and immortality exists. And it always struck me, well, why, if that's what the end goal is, why didn't God create us all in heaven in the first place, you know, and get it over and done with, you know, which partly is what supposed to happen to the angels, but we have to go through this. So this thing of history and material history, but the whole point is that we're being asked to engage together in this wonderful, like you say, it's a mystery, but it's a wonderful mystery of transformation, that it's in our hands to transform this material universe into what God always intended it to be in creation, and the first chapter of Genesis basically tells us that. So, you know, we are engaged collaboratively, not as pawns. We're engaged collaboratively, and that's one of the reasons why it takes so much time, is that we kind of have to learn the skills of this, learn the task and learn the skills of it, so that we can do it. And then once you learn the skills, you have to learn the courage. I mean, they are supposed to go along with the skills to actually do it.
You would literally believe that somehow through humanity understanding the sign of the Lamb of God, that somehow that will in some way teach the animals to stop killing each other.
I do believe that. I do actually. I mean, it's got to
so interesting.
Yeah. It's got to teach us first.
Right. It's a long way to go.
But
But
I
it could
think,
actually, is it really a long way to go, or could it happen very suddenly? I don't know. I don't, we always think of it like the slow evolution process, but it may be a kind of very
well,
explosive
yeah, with
happening, right?
human beings, everything is sped up enormously. I mean, like, basically what 10,000 years since the beginning of the agricultural age, or 10, 15,000 years, whatever it is, beginning of agricultural, and then the Iron Age, and then technology. This is just a blip.
Yeah.
And because we have also reading, we have the signs of reading, we have books, we have sociology, anthropology, we have biblical studies, we have the Bible, we have a tremendous amount of input to enable us to actually make those shifts. It's not like, this is not biological evolution. This is human evolution, and under the pressure of the times, it is required, as Paul says, the time is short. We are required to make those shifts more quickly than slowly. More
Well,
now.
it's interesting that analogy they give about birth pangs, right, in a new
Yeah.
creation, and learning a little bit about midwifery, and what they say. A lot of them, and this maybe is controversial for some, but they say that a lot of the pain that takes place in modern or in childbirth is when, or not just modern, but just in general, is when you try to control the process.
Oh, yeah.
Right, and it's kind of going into the rhythms of the birth pangs.
Yeah.
I'm just from what I've
No, I mean, I
what I've
understand
seen,
what
that
you're saying.
that when you surrender to the process instead of trying to control it and
Yes, that's right.
medicalize it and hospitalize it, you
Yes,
actually exacerbate pain and problems and potential issues. And I think of that as a metaphor for that passage with the Bible, right? As I say, the birth pangs of new creation, we're
yes.
always trying to control and manipulate and coerce it
I think
by
you're
some
right.
kind of imposition, and
I
it
think
makes it
you're right,
worse.
David. I mean, and that's a beautiful analogy, like when you surrender to this thing. I mean, because that's what, when you start talking this way to people who've not really met it before, you can see that look of suspicion come across their eyes. What are you saying here? I mean, like, how are you going to run? I mean, how are we going to defend ourselves against X, Y, Z? There's always threats, and it's very, very dangerous. And you're a pious guy and all the rest of it. But it is a matter of human surrender, of anthropological transformation. And yeah, there is, and many people do comment on that. That once you realize the force of nonviolence, it is actually much more transformative and generative than violence is.
So, from a semiotic standpoint, is the Lord's Supper the way in which we will transform the world, or into that nonviolent species?
Well, that I comment on that in the chapter on Jesus, which is the second full chapter from the end, and I make the connection between Jesus's kind of assault, and I don't know if I use that word, but that's basically what it is. It's a destruction of the temple, destruction of its function. That the temple can no longer function if you get rid of the animals and you get rid of the money that was used to buy the animals, buy the clean, ritually acceptable animals. Once you overturn that process and bring it to a halt, and as Mark says, don't allow anybody to bring vessels. The word is vessels, not stuff. It's vessels through the temple. Then you've brought the whole thing, you've brought that machinery to a grinding halt, which is extremely threatening for humanity. You've brought the machinery whereby we are able to deal with our collective violence, you brought it to a halt. So Jesus has to do something else. I mean, like, the logic of his situation, once he's done that, he's obliged to create this, as you say, performance art. I mean, we were talking beforehand, you used that language, performance art, that he creates this drama, this theater of his own death, his death that's going to come, which is a non-violent death, surrendering to a God of infinite non-violence who can bring him back to life, who can restore his life by filling that life with the intrinsic non-violence of God, the living non-violence of God, the vitality of non-violence. filling Jesus' life with that. He trusts himself to that. And then he creates this little theater. He says, this is my body, this is my blood, eat this, drink this. And again and again, and we're told to do it as often as we remember him. Do this in memory of me, in order to assimilate this incredibly difficult change in human meaning, to actually go the whole way that he went. So he gives us the chance. He's a pedagogue, he's a teacher, that teaches through science, through art and drama, and it does assume a certain amount of time, and we've had 2,000 years, so it assumes a time span wherein we will be able to assimilate this other way of being.
It's interesting how he replaces the temple form of sacrificial mediation with an even more primordial recollection of cannibalism, right?
Yeah, and that's
all right, if we're going to start a whole new religion, we're going to, not a whole new religion, but if we're going to go all the way back and create a whole universal sign, right, that will help humanity get past all of this sacrificial violence, let's start to the primordial one. Let's start with stripped down.
Except there's one huge difference, because homophagia, as they call it, and Giuseppe Fornari has got a big book on Dionysus and the Christ that describes all this, that it was something that was kind of in the background. It was not looked on well, but it was in the background, Dionysian ritual and the Dionysian mysteries, where that would probably happen, some form of cannibalism or homophagia. And that was happening at the same time as, or roughly at the same time, in the same era as Christ institutes his final supper. But the huge difference is that in the primordial scene and in the Dionysian ritual, you are collectively choosing a unwilling victim who is totally the victim of your violence. Totally. I mean, they're torn to pieces. I mean, that's what it does.
That's why he says, do this in remembrance of me. He's recalling that primordial torn apart victim, right?
He's recalling it, but in terms of this profound self-offering that he enacts. You see, so, it's not just a simple ethnographic parallel, even though, people can make it, and you're absolutely right to make it. But there is a revolution going, because he said, I have to go to Jerusalem to suffer. He's in the Gospels, he's chosen this path in order to turn that primordial practice, which is what you're absolutely right, going back to the very roots of human sacrificial and ritual practice, going back to he's turning that outwards and around. So rather than the victim being passive and without a will, the will of the victim does not count. The victim has to collude with the will of the group to kill it. Jesus does not collude with the will of the group, and he's not passive. He actively turns that around, so that then there is manifest within that primordial scene, as you rightly point out. Right. What is manifest is an absolutely different way of being human that comes from this God of infinite nonviolence and compassion.
Yeah, it's like it's saying you are what you eat, right? And so the original act of cannibalism is you are eating the sacrifice of another, and now you are eating the self-sacrifice of yourself.
Yeah, and it's not even
giving up of yourself.
Yes, that's right.
To sacrifice another, right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, sacrifice has all those connotations of doing it to somebody, and that has been the church's version of it since the Middle Ages, that God did this to Jesus. God did this in order to set the balance right in terms of sin and offense and its compensation. But if it is this theater that you're talking about, this is not this is God offering God's self into the human context, into the framework of humanity, in order to transform it from within, to translate that basic action from the kind of instinctive and panicked and angry and hateful discharge of violence into the possibility of the reverse of all those things. That, you know, there's calm, there's peace, there's love, there's self-giving. That's what makes sense of it. And in the book, I kind of point out that for the Jews and most people at the time, apart from that Dionysian stuff, which, as I say, was pretty shady and in the shadows, the actual drinking of blood was taboo. Right. You should not drink blood, because that, in the Jewish world, that belonged to God, only to God, and that was what's given on the altar of sacrifice. So I think we've lost the sense of how kind of scandalous it was that Jesus said, you know, take this cup, the cup of my blood, poured out for you. And the only way that could work, culturally, in terms of the aftermath, you know, in those first years, that they wouldn't be utterly disgusted in this, in the first years of Christianity, was that it communicated not violence, but absolute self-giving love. You know, that's the way in which, and that's still the case when we take it in. You know, we do not feel violence.
Right.
Do not feel the possibility of violence in this. We just feel the forgiveness, the peace.
In some sense, Adam and Eve eating the fruit is a kind of cannibalism attempt, right? Because they're attempting to take what is God's, right? This is God. Right. This is a symbol of God's being and God's otherness, and I want it for myself.
Yeah.
I want to devour it.
Yeah,
it's a sublimated form of cannibalism, and it's
you could say that. I mean, it was good. It's good to look at. It's desirable to the eye and good to eat. You know, there's 3 points of attraction, and desirable to the eye goes along with what you're saying. It's still desirable to the semiotic construction of the individual. I need to take that into myself. I need to take that value, which is God, into myself, so I will be God. Yes, absolutely right.
So when you partake of this supper, you are taking on the renunciation of that insatiable need for the other, right?
Yeah.
You're, in terms of trying to devour it, right?
Right.
You're becoming like the posture that Jesus, you know, does with his work on the cross, right? Is it
absolutely right?
Taking on that,
and there's the renunciation, as you say, of that insatiable need to take in the other, what the other has. The other has this thing that I want, whatever it is, stuff, beauty, fame, whatever it is. I need to take this in. I renounce that, but at the same time, by doing that, I reconnect with the other in an absolutely more beautiful way, because I give myself to the other, and at some point, and certainly in Christ, my gift is accepted. I am cherished in that giving.
Yeah. So it's in some sense, I see it as a kind of satire on the human attempt. You know, that we need a Hercules God, and we need to do that. And Jesus creates the most primordial, on the surface looking ritual, but actually it's the most futuristic, right? Because it's taking us away from, it's stripping down all of the pretense about all of our sophisticated justifications for wars and envy and, you know, social status climbing and every little thing that we add. And it's just laying it all bare and saying, okay, you know, this is what you really are, you know, and this is how we redeem it. You know, it's a similar way to, like, you know, Jerry Boyer, a friend of mine, has pointed out with that, when Paul talks about encountering Jesus, and he quotes Dionysus from the Bacchae, right? It is hard for thee to kick against the pricks, right? And so in some sense, Paul is showing that Jesus is redeeming even the victims that stood in the place of the symbol of Dionysus. You know, that those were actual victims.
Oh, right.
Mentioned, you know, he's redeeming that. He's not redeeming the actual Dionysian way of doing things, but he's redeeming the actual victims of that.
He's redeeming the actual victims, and he's redeeming the significant or semiotic action that is the cannibalism, that intends to gain life but can never give can never gain it. It's always going to end up with a dead body and blood dripping from your fangs. You know, I'm feeling really nasty in the morning.
Right.
It's going to redeem that and bring it into something other place. But I also, you know, wanted to affirm what you were saying back there, that he's this stripping bare business. That's what Paul says. I mean, and it's good that you mentioned Paul. Paul mentions that in Colossians that the powers and authorities, he led them in triumph. He stripped, first of all, he stripped them bare. It's sometimes translated as disarmed, but and it could obviously can have that meaning, but that stripping bare so that you see the naked reality, and it's held up for show. I mean, that's what the Greek word, it's held up for show for us to see. So that's what Christ does. It's kind of irresistible, transformative meaning making, you know, and you know, the more we get hold of it, and that's why Gerard is so, we owe so much to him. He's so valuable in terms of having laid this out as an anthropological theory. That the more you see this, you know, it becomes irresistible what Christ has done, you know, or semi-irresistible anyway, I think.
Because it encapsulates the whole point of history and
Yes,
the whole existential problems that humans face, you know, and all of this.
huge problems, because we are these violent creatures who are hidden from ourselves. So it's a, you know, it's a double whammy. You know, we're very angry, very reactive, very challenged, very jealous, envious, as you say.
Yeah.
And yet we don't see that. We think we're kind of noble and
That's
right.
what I see with, you know, the West, currently the globalism or Westernism, where you have this obsession with victimism, right? And Gerard
Right, yeah.
talks about this, and this idea that I have found that it seems as if cultures that have been haunted by the gospel and these signs for the longest uninterrupted period of cultural hegemony of these ideas percolating are utterly haunted by differentiation more than they are violence. Like there's a lag. You know, we're way hypersensitive about differentiation because in our understanding of violence, we have that the gospel is slowly unveiling. We realize that differentiation can be the occasion for sacrifice, right? Right. If you are too tall and everybody else is a certain height, you might be the one that's the odd man out, odd woman out. If you're very, very deformed, if you're an ethnic minority and everybody else is the other race or something, all these different differentiations can be the occasion for
Yes,
exclusion and sacrifice.
right.
It doesn't mean that different, but what happens with the Western religion that I see that we're trying to, you know, impose around the world is we must violently root out all differentiation because we can't allow any of those opportunities for misfits to be sacrificed again. But in so doing that, we're always creating more and more violence because we are slower to recognize how we're all complicit in violence than we are to recognize how differentiation can be a source of inequity.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. But I mean, there's a lot to say on that, really. My wife works in healthcare, right? She's a nurse practitioner, and she has worked and still does work in the fields of AIDS and of the LGBTQ community. And she and her clinic are extremely supportive to that community, and then to transgendered people, and all this is kind of, it's wonderful in its way, because what it does, it makes those distinctions, those differences, not relevant anymore. What is relevant, I think, is relationship. It should be, it's freeing people into, but the kind of regime in which that operates is that there's always somebody finding out the latest difference that you're ignoring and therefore end up by sacrificing. And the last one she came home with, I had not heard it before, was neurodiversity. Now, again, you know, and we're talking about ADHD. We're talking people with neural disorders, what we would call disorders in the past, but now because you choose the language of diversity, it is not a disorder anymore. It's a different way of being human.
Yeah.
And of course, that is essentially Christian's way, because you respect the other person no matter what the condition is, and you do not impose upon them the kind of prefigured hierarchy of value and meaning, But this has become now, so if you use the wrong language in respect of these groups, you will be condemned and you will become the one who sacrificed. You're the one who's doing bad, and there's a tremendous amount of energy in that. I mean, that's what she talks about. It's not so much the actual using good, respectful, kind language. It's the energy that goes into condemning you should you make a mistake. And she's always mentioning that to me. And it is that, so that's the way in which the world, within a kind of half Christianized world, a semi-Christianized world where the victim is revealed, it tries to reinvent the differentiation achieved by violence. And the only one as Gerard has said it, the only person who can be victimized is the victimizer, and the only who can be scapegoated is the scapegoater, Yeah. So that you can see how the energy, that's where primordial human energy is. We're always looking for the one that we can just dump it on somehow or other. But what Jesus does is translate and transform that into an entirely different kind of energy, into a self-giving energy that allows the other and wants the other to live, whoever he is, they are,
I think that we would continue to have fever dreams of being haunted and chasing off new pockets of differentiation, so long as we don't address the violence.
Yes, exactly right. Because meantime, the Pentagon budget is enormously inflated. Right. We can't find the money for the inner cities. Yeah. We can't find the money for education, for proper education, or for support for people with challenges.
More importantly than we can't find the money, we can't find the time, right, to invest in one another and actually.
That's exactly right. But in the meantime, we can find the time for the machinery of war, and that is.
We dress it up, though. We dress up the machinery. Pentagon embracing critical theory and these things. We're dressing it up with victim language.
That's right.
We will lecture the terrorists about their pronouns before we drop missiles on their villages. I mean, come on. I mean, this is kind of what we're dealing with.
I think that's right. I think that is right. I mean, we have this internal. Obviously, we're trying to. Any society tries to exclude violence, but we have the whole gun problem. That's another issue. But they try to exclude violence from within the walls of the city. But we still need the sacrificial system if we're hanging on to that meaning of humanity. And so there is this attempt at differentiation at hyper differentiation. In the meantime, we still have this massive machinery of actual physical destruction. The number of military bases across the world from the US is enormous. No one's ever had that amount of military presence in the world before, and that's not raised to thought. But once you begin to see that the point of Christianity is to say inject, I know it's kind of like a violent word, but in a non-violent way, inject into the human system this kind of vaccine of the cross, which is the faithful non-violence of God, is God's faithfulness, as the Hesed, God's faithful kindness, steadfast love, which is always spoken about in the Old Testament, to inject that into the human system, not as a moral kind of option, as like, I've spent my life trying to be a good Christian kind of thing, something that I achieved by my merits or my efforts. But no, it's actually a radically new, different way of being human being. And it's something that happens in the midst of human crisis, which is always the case. There's a crisis that demands it. And I think, yes, so we're at this turning point in many ways.
It reminds me, another example is a kind of demented example of our globalist Western mentality is like, how they would put the murals of George Floyd in Kabul, Afghanistan by the State Department. And you're thinking,
oh, really?
Yeah,
I
they
didn't
used to
know
do
that.
when before they left. You know, they had these murals and paintings of George Floyd, and you think about only a Girardian framework can really give insight into why does this late stage empire feel the need to show its own victims, its own martyrs of its own
And its own
system
virtue by
on the
recognizing.
on the outpost of one of its imperial conquests and say, hey,
Look how
look, you should
self-conscious we are of our violence at home, and meanwhile,
and you need to celebrate this too. But it's
yeah,
like these victims, these Kabul Afghanis are not going to understand this. They're going to say, okay, what does this have to do with us? You're imposing your, knee on our necks every day for 20 years now. What does this have to do with us? You're almost rubbing it in. But what kind of a society
yeah,
is so blinded by its own victim laced
yeah.
hypocrisy and mythic framework of being this messianic figure to redeem the world by imposing its victimology by force, or
That's
I
very
mean,
interesting because in the past, in the 19th century, the Brits, for example, they would have built churches. I mean, that would have been their murals. They would have had Jesus up there, like Jesus crucified for our sins, and you better get with the program, otherwise you're going to go to hell. But that doesn't. We're not doing that anymore. But we will put it. I mean, we will put our George Floyds on the walls of a broken down Afghanistan house.
it's because America covets Jesus's position as the messianic figure to root out injustice, but it uses violence,
Yeah,
and so
yeah.
that's why Girard called it an antichrist. The antichrist being the one that tries to compete with Jesus's project for nonviolence, but through
Yes,
violent means.
absolutely, absolutely. And when people point out, uh, if you say he, when you should say they have chosen that pronoun, and I perfectly accept people's rights to do that and the meaning of that, the relational meaning of that. But when we say, oh no, you've got the wrong pronoun there, it's they. How could you possibly do that? You're bad. They are creating that alternative regime. And it's a kind of mirror image. It's a distorted image of the of the of the cross,
Right.
breaking down the distinctions, but not breaking them down in order to make a new distinction, but to create this flow, as this communication, this energy, this ecstasy of love.
Right. What does that mean? Ecstasy of love.
I use that word really because human beings are kind of ecstatic creatures. In other words, we stand outside of ourselves. I mean, that's mimesis is a form of ecstasy.
Right.
If I want your nice red curtain behind you that you've got behind you, then I am in an ecstatic. It's not a good ecstasy. It's a bad ecstasy. It's a rivalrous ecstasy. But when I think that in Christ, God stands outside of God's self into the world. There's an ecstatic God, a God who stands into the world on the cross, pouring God's self out, and we're asked to join that other ecstasy so that we stand outside ourselves in love.
Yeah.
Now, you can't get away as a human being from being an ecstatic creature.
Yeah.
You're always looking for that ecstasy, whatever it is.
Right. The way I see the mimetic uh, rivalry in the West playing out between what we call left and right polarity
Yeah,
is
right.
something like I call it the Elephant Man syndrome or the Elephant Man effect, which is the story of Joseph Merrick, the individual who had the deformities that they called him Elephant Man in England, and they paraded him around in different circuses and so forth. Now they made a movie about David Lynch made a movie about him that was regarded well, but I say this that the current cultural wrestling with victims and the sign of the slain lamb looks
Right.
like something like the left saying, because Elephant Man has been persecuted in the past, he shall now be the standard of beauty. That you cannot distinguish between, what he looks like versus any, normally featured person and say that normal features are preferential to what he
Right.
looks like.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so they try to make that the new regime,
Yeah.
How dare you say that this is not the standard of beauty that we should all accept as a valid form that you should like? And if you don't want to date Elephant Man, you are hating him. You know, that's what we hear today with other contexts. And in the same sense, the right dialectically reacts to that and says, no, he's ugly. He's a freak. Put him in a freak show, right? And so
Yeah.
what's happening there? Nothing good is really going on there.
No, that's right.
Right? Because the Christian answer is not to choose either. We don't say, okay, this is now the new regime. You must say this is beautiful or else you are a monster and we will scapegoat you, deplatform you or debank you. That's what the establishment kind of wants to do to the reactionaries. And then the reactionary, you can't do that and just say, oh no, you're ugly, you're a freak because somebody told me you're sacred now. So we have to follow Christ, which is to love this person as a human being.
And to let go of that mania from making those differentiations based in violence, you know, because what Christ does is overcomes those, what Paul calls the stoicheia, the elements of the world, the differentiations of the world, the way the world is chopped up. And of course, as you say, the left, it has to invent a whole new set, you know, in order to keep the world the way it is and enter into this other way of being in relationship, which it kind of gives up. I mean, like it is basically loving your enemy, because whoever it is who's coming up against me in some way and annoying me, or, you know, wanting to hurt me, and this could be just in terms of language or in power hierarchy, I'm going to try and create some kind of differentiation from that person that puts that person in a place where I'm not going to be hurt anymore. And it's actually a way of fighting back. But if you love that person, you love on that person through the cross and through the crucified and the resurrected crucified, then you're overcoming that. You're overcoming that mania for distinction, and you're loving the Elephant Man, and you're loving the beautiful person at the same time. Because the beautiful person, you know, like the film star or the model, you know, they can get scapegoated just as easily. You know, they
exactly
according to the Girardian.
That's the problem with the revolutionary liberational approach, which is that tries to scandalize the beautiful person or the person who's relatively rich.
Right.
These things are just part of the same continuum, right? You know, you can sacrifice the king and a beggar, and Jesus doesn't make a distinction. Well, you sacrifice the king, so you're less sinful than the one who sacrificed the beggar.
Yeah,
It
that's
doesn't
right.
work that way, does it?
It doesn't work that way, no. Because that's exactly right. Because you're entering into an entirely new divine ecstasy, as I say, a different anthropology, a different way of being in the world. And I mean, that's the gospel. When Jesus says at the end of the gospel, "Go forth and teach all nations." I mean, that's the job.
Right.
It is a matter of explaining to people the good news, and the good news is something that has built up over 1,000 years, beginning with the Exodus, and that reaches the point of breakthrough in the cross.
So I want to go to this. We were wanting to talk about the sign of Jonah. Luke chapter 11, verse 29 says, as the crowds increased, Jesus said, "This is a wicked generation that asks for a sign, but none will be given it except the sign of Jonah. For as Jonah was a sign to the Ninevites, so also will the Son of Man be to this generation." What can you, in this book, you go into signs of change, you go into the sign of Jonah.
Right.
Give us some insights a little bit as to what he's talking about. Why does he choose the sign of Jonah to reference for his ministry as he heads to Jerusalem? Or he's in Jerusalem at that point, right?
I know. I think he's on his way there.
Okay,
I think he's on his way there. But anyway, it doesn't matter. He probably repeated it when he was in Jerusalem. Yeah. That's an excellent question, and I think it is, and I think that the sign of Jonah is a kind of hidden clue to Jesus's meaning and purpose in the scriptures, in the Gospels, and we're talking about basically Matthew and Luke here. Mark doesn't mention it, and John doesn't mention it, but the mention in Mark and Matthew and Luke is kind of like coming in as I say, from left field. It doesn't seem to follow a major pattern, a major scriptural pattern, where we would say the servant of Isaiah or the son of man that we get, one like a son of man we get from Daniel, these are seen as major prophetic patterns. The son of Jonah doesn't seem to be that, because Jonah is not a good guy.
Yeah. Yeah.
Jonah is a miscreant. He's a runaway, curmudgeonly, bad-tempered, essentially violent prophet. And in the book, when I do the story of the book of Jonah, it's the last of the Old Testament books, I say, well, the real counterpart to Jonah, the original Jonah, is the book of Nahum, which is pitched, the language and its prophecy is pitched violently against Nineveh. Nineveh, the violent city, never without a victim. It actually says that, covered in blood, never without. Nineveh was this.
That's
sorry?
Jonah saying that in Nahum?
No, it's Nahum.
Nahum. Okay.
Nahum says that. Nineveh, never without a victim, covered in blood, and looks forward to its destruction at the hands of the Babylonians, which it was. It was destroyed.
And Nineveh, what was the history at the time of what Nineveh had done to Jonah's
well,
people?
Nineveh was, the capital of Assyria in modern day Iraq. I mean, these cities are fairly close to each other, but these are city-states that eventually expand into an empire. So Nineveh was an important city with the Assyrian people. It was the capital city, and the remains there are supposedly pretty impressive still. But what they did was eventually they were the first of the empires, the Mesopotamian empires that came in and conquered Israel. Israel was given to God by the people, given to the people by God, and they came in from Egypt, and they set themselves up in this little narrow strip of land, modern day Palestine, and Israel, and they existed there for, I don't know, I say about 500 years in relative peace, because those imperial forces, Egypt and Mesopotamia, were relatively weak at the time. But then these powers, beginning with Assyria, began to grow, and Assyria came in and destroyed the northern kingdom. They destroyed Samaria. They destroyed the lineage of northern kings, and whatever was left, apparently they came as refugees to Judea, which was all that was left of Israel. And that was all that was left of Israel all the way through from the beginning of the 7th century, essentially, to the 600s. So it was a long time. It was just Judea. And so the nation that had done that had crushed probably the more prosperous part of Israel, and with great cruelty led them off into slavery, into exile, was hated the way that any nation, any controlling and invading nation, imperial nation, would be hated. They were the epitome of the enemy. And of course, that was succeeded by Babylon, who then destroyed Judea and the temple, except that the exiles did return under the Persians. But then the Persians eventually were defeated by the Greeks, and the Greeks then paved the way for the Romans. So you have this expanding kind of choreography of empires. One comes after another, and they're each worse than the other, as Daniel tells us in his visions in chapter 7 of Daniel. So you begin the empires with Assyria. They are a symbol. So if Jonah is written, the book of Jonah is written in post-exilic times, which it probably is, it's too sophisticated for something before that. It's too clever and too kind of like you say, like satirical. It's too smart.
Yeah.
Unless there's been some distance where you begin to see things more clearly. So the prophet used the righteous, should we say, who then becomes a prophet because he's included in the prophecies, chooses Assyria as the symbol, as the sign of oppressive, cruel, violent empire. And then he says, well, hang on, God wants to convert them. and God actually does convert them.
Yeah.
He changes their hearts. So they let go. It says explicitly, the king tells everybody, let go of the violence in your hand. And they do. And Jonah, the prophet, is the only one who remains violent. He remains angry as heck because he wants revenge on Nineveh. Naturally, like we do want to see the bombs fall on the oppressive city, the city of blood. We want to see that destroyed. And of course, at the end of the book of Jonah, Jonah is sat on this hill looking out to see the bombs fall, and they don't fall. And then God has to intercede with Jonah and say, well, come on, this is a city of 120,000 people, not to say anything about the animals as well. And can't you have compassion on them? So this is argument. None of it is this brilliant argument, so well written, there's so many little puns and internal references in the book about the hatred that you could conceive as an Israelite for the enemies of God's people, the people that God has chosen and given us this land. And these enemies have come and destroyed us and destroyed the land. That hatred, which would, on one hand, would seem very natural and theologically right, does not God hate the enemies of his own people? But suddenly the prophet says, no, actually, God wants to change them and does in the story change them. So I think children might believe that there's a real Jonah in the belly of the fish, but I think anybody thinking about it and thinking about not just the extraordinary, outlandish character of a guy surviving in the belly of a fish all the way through to the coast of Iraq, and there was no known seaway for that at that time. They did not know there was a route around Africa, anyway, that's far too far for the poor fish to swim. It's just an outlandish concept. And then the concept of the conversion of the Ninevites, lock, stock, and barrel, is itself more outlandish. So it's obviously a parable. It's obviously a parable, the same as the parable of the prodigal son or the Good Samaritan. It's a story told to make a point. And there may be outlandish elements in it, but the point is what counts. And for some reason or other, the rabbis, whoever they were, who put together or accepted the canon, the accepted body of texts which were considered of the Bible, considered divine revelation, Jonah was accepted in there. So there was something about that message that resonated. Jesus picks it up. Jesus, when he says, he understood it. Jesus, like Girard, I think, was a great reader of texts. He understood text because he could tell a story himself. He could tell a great story. He knew how to tell stories that had semiotic power, that could change your way of looking at things in a sentence. It could flip you around. He could do that, his aphorisms, his short sayings, but also the stories. So I think Jesus recognized this as both an incredibly powerful, transformative story and a prophecy. In other words, he believed this came from God. This was not just some very smart writer setting down this outlandish fantasy. No, this is God's word. And so when he says the only sign that is going to be given to you is the sign of Jonah, he is referencing that whole thing. He's referencing the transformation of the human space and of the relational space that we're all in, from violence to non-violence. And I don't think the evangelists understood this. I don't think either Luke or Matthew really understood it, because they don't expand on it. They just drop this sign on us. And that's one reason why I think it's authentic, because it's such a peculiar sign, the sign of Jonah. If you talk about the sign of Elijah, oh yeah, we understand what that is, because that's fire from heaven that's going to smoke the holocausts Elijah and leave the holocausts of the prophets of Baal, soaked and not burning. That's a sign we can, or a sign from, say, from Jeremiah, that he said that in 70 years you will return from exile, and so that was proven true, and that's something that's got concrete kind of evidential power to it. But the sign of Jonah is a story. Now, Matthew tries to interpret it by saying, just as Jonah was 3 days in the belly of the whale, Jesus will be 3 days in the belly of the earth. And I think that's a way that Matthew, the writer of the gospel, is exegeting the tradition of the sign of Jonah. But I don't think that's what it means, because Luke doesn't have it.
Well, it could mean that, but more, right? Because you said,
well, yes, obviously that's right. It could, so it includes that, but that's very just on its own is kind of slightly mechanical and
that's usually how it's typically
formal.
That's usually how it's typically understood.
Oh yeah, that is right, because Matthew says it. But
Yeah.
I think that Jesus, with his imagination, and especially if you're talking about, this generation is an evil generation because it wants a sign.
Right.
That's what the text says.
It then goes on to say, the queen of the south will rise at the judgment with the people of this generation, condemn them. That's Ethiopia, right? Queen.
Yeah, that's right. So I think that's a separate saying.
Okay.
So I think the sign saying is one saying, and then the saying of Jonah shall arrive, and the people of Nineveh, not Jonah, the people of Nineveh will arise and condemn, and the Queen of Sheba will arise and condemn this generation, because they repented, or because they in the Queen of Sheba's case, she came to hear the wisdom of the prophet. So Jesus, in that pericope, I think, which has been joined on to the sign statement, that says that Jesus is claiming as two of his key motifs by which he understands himself is Solomon, the greatest teacher of wisdom, and then so he's saying there's this he is a figure of wisdom, and I think the whole overturning of human violence is a final act of wisdom. That it is a wisdom transformation to be able to, what Gerard is saying is, we are grounded in violence, but yet the cross turns that over. That's a wisdom. That is a radical wisdom. So Jesus is saying there's radical wisdom in here, but then also this this kind of like motif figure, this claimed ancestor figure of significance is Jonah. Now, Jonah is, as I was saying, is not a figure you'd normally claim. And the reason why Jesus claims him is because of the entire nonviolence of the story. That's why I think he claims him. And the fact, yes, you're right, that it will mean his going to death, and that he will be restored. Yeah, you're absolutely right. And Matthew is right in that respect. I'm just saying it's not just simply the 3 days in the earth, that he will be restored to life.
Says now something greater than Jonah is here. It's almost like he's, it's also implying that, even Jonah, as stubborn as he was to repent of his violence, maybe, I don't know. And it's not really saying
no,
that,
I mean,
it could be that he's saying that you guys are worse than Jonah at this,
He's saying you're worse than Jonah. And the point about Jonah is that he, despite his bad attitude,
he did what he was supposed to do.
He did convert the Ninevites.
What was his message? What does it say in Jonah? What does he say?
Jonah doesn't do anything except
he just shows up, right?
He just walks across. He walks across the city, which takes, I think, 3 days or something. I think it's a big city, and he says, "In 40 days, this place is going to be destroyed." That's all he says. He wants it to be destroyed. He doesn't say change or anything. They change. They choose to change. He wants it to be destroyed, but his message worked.
Did they change? Did they change because they were fearful of being destroyed?
I think they changed because of the inherent.
Did they see him come out of that fish?
Yes, I think the story works because he comes out of the fish. Yeah. I think in literary terms, their transformation is credible, you know, in like one bit of the story leads to another. It's credible because he comes out of the fish. He should have been swallowed up. He was in a very, very bad place as an attitude. He was sleeping in the stern of the ship. He wasn't helping the sailors, and the sailors say, you know, you pray to your God, and he says, throw me in. You know, he is the original passive aggressive victim. You know, throw me in. That's where I belong, because, you know, I don't want this God bringing mercy on people. But then he's saved from his anger. He's saved from, he has this wonderful prayer in the middle of the fish. Out of the belly of death, I cried, and the Lord delivered me. So there is this, I think that's what makes, as a story, I think that's what makes the Ninevites' conversion work.
And Jonah's posture in the ship when the storm is coming is similar to Jesus' people, right? Because they're saying, you know, God's demand human sacrifice, you know, and they don't, right? And so throw me in, I'll be the sacrificial victim. And a lot of the church still believes in that view of God that Jonah had in the storm of the ship, that says, well, there's a problem, there's a crisis. God demands the sacrifice of a human to be propitiated of his wrath and to stop.
Right, that's what everybody understands. Somebody has to take the hit, you know, so that take one for the team, as they say, you know.
Right.
And that's the way human beings work. But it's really interesting, I mean, that you bring it up, that in other ways the Jonah story has reference in the scripture, because in chapter 4 of Mark doesn't include the language of the sign of Jonah. He has a kind of an episode which is very close to it, but the story of Jesus calming the storm is very similar to the story of Jonah in those first passages, and where the storm is raging. Jesus is asleep in the stern, where just like Jonah was. The disciples wake him up and say, "Do not care that we're going to perish." This is exactly what the sailors say to Jonah, right, in the story of Jonah. And then this immense calm comes, and awe, a kind of divine awe, falls on the sailors and on the disciples. So it seems to me that Mark chapter 4, I mean, I am extrapolating a little bit, but I think that there was a catechesis of Jonah in the early community that the gospel writer is setting down there. And I think that, you know, whatever actual story of a calming of the storm it was interpreted in Jonah terms, because then what comes afterwards, directly afterwards, that at the end of chapter 4, beginning of chapter 5, is the liberation, the exorcism of the Gerasene demoniac, who was inhabited by a legion.
That's interesting, yeah.
Which is a
symbol of empire and everything.
So Jesus basically goes to Nineveh after the storm. He goes to Nineveh, and he casts out the violence from Nineveh.
Interesting. Yeah, I can totally see that there too. But he does it in a non-violent way. Nobody is thrown over. Peter is not thrown overboard to make that.
That's right.
Storm
in
stop.
Luke, the pigs go into the abyss. So there's a kind of like, there is a displacement there, because I think the story is dealing with the reality of violence, and it's just to say that the people are going to ask, where does it go? Well, it goes into that primordial space, the abyss, into the sea, which Jesus himself enters into in the Jonah story, in the Jonah pattern, in his death. And that's where he redeems, he transforms even the abyss of primordial violence into peace.
And so going back to the sign of Jonah, the people who want to kill Jesus, they're worried about the storms, right, of their culture, right? And so they want to throw him overboard. They want to kill him to get the wrath of God abated against their community, to stop it. Yeah. And then the whale is the literary device of God's love coming in and rescuing Jesus.
Exactly right.
Through resurrection, right?
Yeah, it is. I think you're absolutely right. I think it's a literary device, because it loses its power if you think if you try to think of it as a fairy story / real thing, you know, that it really happened. No, it's a
There's some
literary.
pretty big catfish in the Galilee, Sea of Galilee. I've seen them because they don't eat those things. You know, those things are pretty big. I remember seeing
Oh,
one
I
this
didn't
year.
know that. They
Yeah,
have
they're pretty
catfish.
huge. I said, hey, could a little Jonah fit in that? A little, maybe a little Zacchaeus could. Some big because they don't eat those fish, you know.
Oh,
So,
right. I've seen the St. Peter's fish. They're delightful.
but you know, I was just thinking about that more about what you're saying though. It's very interesting because so the I think that the fish is kind of like an apocalyptic device showing God's love, breaking up
Yes,
the
I
old
think it is.
pattern of fake
Yeah,
gods and fake myths, right? Yeah,
I
these
think
false
you're
gods.
right. Absolutely right. I think that's right, David. Because when you get to Daniel at the beginning, and we know when Daniel was written, is written in the early years of the second century before Christ. The sea is very important there in chapter 7 as the place from which these monsters come forth.
Right.
And they are the successive monsters of empire. They are, if you read the monsters in terms of the succession of four kingdoms, which is articulated elsewhere, the Babylonians, the Medes, the Persians, and the Greeks. And then each one gets worse until you end up with the Greeks, who were better at war than anybody else. That's why Alexander the Great conquered everybody, and then the Romans just imitated the Greeks. You're talking about a force on earth, which I think in the Exodus, for example, or in Genesis, perhaps Genesis probably written after the Exodus. I mean, they don't, those books don't see the power of empire. They see the power of oppression, but it's kind of I think Israel and Canaan are within the zone of influence of Egypt. It's all part of the same traditional. If we think the Egypt had been there already for 1,000 years at this point, it's all part of the same traditional worldview. But when you get to the aftermath of the 6th century, and then you're going on down the line, the writers, the biblical writers, and I include here Jonah and Daniel, understood that there's this force on earth that is not going to stop. They did. I don't think they clearly understood that at the beginning, but now they understand this force is going to kill everything. It's going to kill us all. There's nothing that can, the Israelites could fight little battles against Moabites or whoever, and win some of them, but you can't fight these great empires. There's no way you can fight them. They tried. That was the amazing thing after Jesus, that they were so amped up by the violence of their situations that they did try to rebel, and then they were crushed, and the temple was destroyed ever since. I mean, it was an apocalyptic moment. So I think the writers understand you're dealing with something that only a supernatural intervention can deal with. And so when the supernatural intervention comes, it comes in terms of the cross.
You mentioned that the monsters in the Old Testament were connected to empires, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Does that mean that the
they're
fish,
symbols of empire?
does that mean the great fish could be Rome in the sign of Jonah?
Yeah, I mean, the great fish is Rome or Persia, transformed by God into the possibility of peace. It is this monster of the deep. There's nothing that can go down into the deep except these creatures that live there, and the bigger they are, the more monstrous they are. And yet this creature does the will of God and preserves this guy. So yeah, it is a figure of a transformation. I think it's what Paul is saying, that Christ is raised up above the powers and authorities. Ultimately, they can be transformed.
Yeah, and that's what the picture of heaven with the kings, right?
Coming in the end, the book of Revelation. Yeah,
that's all very, very interesting, and it's, of course, the great mystery is how do we get from here to there? But
I feel you, David. I feel you. I know that's true, because sometimes in my more human moments, I think, well, I believe this stuff, and I love the way it all connects, and it makes sense. It makes absolute sense. How's it going to happen? Well, the thing is, you don't know. You don't, like the fall of the Berlin Wall. was utterly unexpected. 1989. It was utterly unexpected. I didn't expect it. No one expected it. It just came down, and it came down in a hurry. Things can happen. I mean, the fall of the Berlin Wall is a lot to do with the power of the West, the influence of the West. But we're talking about something much more powerful and generative, a transformation of the way we do business on Earth. But I think that can happen as well. I mean, we've had stuff like the Commission on Truth and Reconciliation in South Africa, and I'm friends with local.
But yet South Africa is not going in a good direction right
now. No, it is no. But these are momentary things, you know. And there was a moment when there could have been a bloodbath. There's 20 million Black Africans in South Africa and about 1 million white Africans, so they could all have been killed. There could have been a horrendous war. It didn't happen. And then I have Turkish friends here who are Muslims. They're good. They're very faithful Muslims, and they're followers of a guy called Fethullah Gulen, who is a teacher, an Islamic teacher of nonviolence. And he teaches his disciples, he teaches these people not to retaliate because they have been victimized and persecuted by the current president of Turkey, who's a guy called Erdogan. And there's actually going to be an election fairly shortly. But I mean, he's one of these guys who's taken over and uses Islam as a kind of moral armor to promote himself. But these guys are the ones I know are genuinely nonviolent. And this guy Fethullah Gulen, he lives in Pennsylvania. He's in exile. Erdogan wants to get him back home so he can probably execute him. He genuinely teaches. He says you're going to have to forgive these people who have done this to you. He teaches that these people have done really horrible things to their families, excluded them from work. They've lost their jobs as professors, as judges, as lawyers, whatever. And some have been imprisoned and tortured, that kind of thing. And Fethullah Gulen says you're going to have to forgive them because the future demands it. So I see these as little signs that anybody with kind of spiritual wisdom knows this is the way forward. We cannot conduct the world.
There's opportunities abounding for Christians to figure out how to create creative acts of signs of God's love. Like can you imagine if, like I'm looking, Tucker Carlson revealed some of the footage about the Capitol Police, escorting some of these January 6th, rioters around the Capitol building and talking about how, some of this may have been an optics event to try to frame people as wholly other. You can imagine if prominent Democrats would reach across the aisle and say, let's forgive and reconcile with January 6th people. Sentence them for 20, 30 years for trumped up things because of the political hotness of the sacred
absolutely temple. David. I mean, I think we are in a kind of like as you use the word, a fever dream, and I think we are it's like we're in a very mentally unhealthy state at the moment, collectively, but we can, I think, snap out of it. I think something like what you're talking about could bring us out of it.
Showing love, love, and Christians should be modeling this in the public square somehow, and not modeling it in their enclaves and saying how bad everybody else is, but just saying, look, we're going to literally do something that's going to put us a little uncomfortable, and that could be things that could really have transformative signs that would reverberate for the community to model, right? That's what we need. Absolutely. We're just desperate for it. And I don't see any of it happening. I mean, I know it's happening. I'm just saying I can't point to a moment in our recent history where you have that apocalyptic lion and the lamb where a MAGA guy is hugging an Antifa guy. That needs to happen. Those things need to happen.
And you're just saying that on this program is a way of beginning it happening. I mean, who knows what the lines of influence are, but it will happen because it's the only way. It's the only way in which Nineveh is going to be saved.
Yeah.
It's the only way.
Yeah, Nineveh is going to be saved despite our protestations to that, right? We're trying to protest that. We don't want that because we feel like the other team deserves to get, persecuted for their bad behavior, but
Yeah, really.
that's not
Yeah.
really going to solve anything at the end of the day.
No, it is not. You're absolutely right.
But it's a sign, though, it's a sign of Christ. I was saying this to a friend yesterday. It's a sign of Christ's power over violence that, I mean, can you imagine if there was they called it a capital insurrection, January 6th. Imagine if that happened during Jesus' day. They would not be taking selfies and having little grandmas waving flags. They would have been attacking, throat slashing, horrible things, right?
Yeah, right.
And it's precisely Christ's work in history that neuters a kind of rip-off version of an insurrection that doesn't have any plans or any aspirations as to what they're going to do once they're egged into going into the Capitol building. That shows you the power of Christ's nonviolence neutering sacrificial violence in its teeth. That it's losing its potency.
I think you're right. I think you're right, because they did have an attack on the Capitol in the year 68, whatever it was. The Zealots and Sicarii took over in Jerusalem, and they killed the Romans, and then the Romans came and killed them all. A million plus victims of that war, according to some. So yeah, I think a lot has happened, and it has been neutered. I mean, we're always on the edge and we're scared, but I think you're absolutely right. The language and the imagery is different now. It is different, and the way that our understanding of it is different. I'm trying to understand things. You see that event itself, the Capitol insurrection. What was it? Four police officers or something were killed. Relatively speaking, not many were killed, but it has huge symbolic significance, and rightly so. I mean, it was an invasion of the seat of government. But so our world of symbolism and signs now is almost as important as, at least in the contiguous United States, as because, as we were saying before, the violence goes elsewhere. But it's almost as important as actual violence. So it's really, I mean, as you described, the kind of left wing and then the right wing, their language and the news media, they're trying to capture the symbolic high ground. They're trying to capture.
Yeah. The speaker called it an invasion of our sacred temple of democracy.
Yeah,
which is interesting when you use the word temple, right? Because that's where sacrifice happens.
Oh,
so it's
absolutely.
like she's saying, we are the world's experts in authority on insurrection.
Yeah.
If there's an insurrection on the global stage in the last 100 years, you can guarantee that a lot of its power was developed in that building. And so she's saying this is the holy place of democracy, and you do not defile it. We will do these. We will fund these regime changes in Egypt. We'll refund. We'll do it in Iran, in Tehran. That's for those people. But you don't dare bring that kind of mob ugliness into our sacred temple. That's completely religious language. It's very Girardian.
It is. It's making those arbitrary distinctions that make the world work.
Right. We alone have the right to not be tampered by the mob, but we alone have the right to unleash the mob on everybody else's Capitol building around the world. Right. Yeah.
And that's why.
That's the irony of having folks like the Cheney lady running it, right? Because her family is so synonymous with, going around with regime change chaos in Iraq and all these other places where millions of people die, but their lives are not as sacred as our government's lives. But so we are tampering with the religion. These events are tampering with the sacred signs surrounding our establishment religion.
Yeah, I mean,
once you see it, you can't unsee it. You can't put the reverence back, unfortunately.
Yeah, that is right. And so we have to have another road. We can't reestablish the sacred at the Capitol. It's going to be very difficult to do it unless we, kill millions and millions, and even that won't do it. So we have to have another basis for human communication and meaning, and that is forgiveness and love.
And I think that there's a relationship between the signs that you point out in the Bible and media technology. right? I think that, you know how Gerard talks about how the gospel helps create technological innovations.
Yeah, right.
We stop burning witches and we start looking at magnifying glasses, right?
Yeah, right.
Well, I think that happens also with media technology. The gospel accelerates the evolution of media technology, which allows human beings to come. I believe that the gospel sign of the slain lamb infects whatever media paradigm human beings are working with.
I think you're right.
And I think that now that the digital age, where every person, including dissidents in Tehran and dissidents in North Korea and China and everywhere, can have access to high-speed internet and workarounds propaganda, myth is going to accelerate in its decay, and it's going to
Yeah.
accelerate in its untouchability, and the stories of the slain lambs will become much more globally understood, which is an exciting time to be alive.
Yeah, so that in a way kind of answers your question. How do we get from here to there?
Exactly.
I think that is absolutely right. I think you're right. I mean, that
Well,
was
I really
well,
appreciate your time. Any last thoughts or anything before we part ways?
no, I mean, I appreciate. I mean, when you get into the actual political realm, and I kind of admire it in a way, because I like the discussion of the Capitol insurrection, whatever it is. I tend to avoid that because I'm trying to explain all the time what I see as the core of the gospel. And once you get there, people get heated and upset and angry and stuff. And I don't want to deflect from the telling that story, telling that transformative story. But you're absolutely right. It has knock-on effects. And I think, the way you're describing or at least interrogating them, trying to understand them is absolutely right.
Well, I think the it's very dangerous in terms of getting it. You don't want to get people angry or emotional, but I think it's very important to do it because that way it doesn't stay hit up in rarefied air or safety glass. That you
Okay.
actually are able to enact the kind of anthropological implications of what these stories are saying in our time, instead
In
of
our time.
something that is only a museum piece. It's something that
Yeah,
actually.
absolutely. So bravo.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate your time, Dr. Bartlett. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
And
Thank
check
you.
out the book, Signs of
Yeah, that's right.
Signs
Check
of
out the
Change.
book, get it on Amazon or wherever, and read it, because I think it's a good study. I mean, like, if you go through it chapter by chapter in group, it's very worth doing. It's very worth, and I recommend it to pastors to use it that way.
Well, very good. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, David. Bless you.